tips on how to make your letter make change. Hopefully these presentations have inspired you to think about writing your own letter. Let's see here, make sure. Tip number 1, write about what you care and know about. So this is a picture of the Blue River. I don't know much about the Blue River, but I've been there. And I like to start all of my comments with something that I can actually write about from a first person perspective, or ideally something maybe I really actually do know a bunch about if I've spent some time in an area or if I've seen a wolf. I think that this helps to establish a voice of confidence, and it's also just sort of starts out the chore of writing these letters to feel more fun. So I recommend starting there. Tip 2 is don't be afraid to make it personal. I think we have also a lot of pressure to sound like experts, and there probably are many people on this call that are experts and maybe have some letters after their name and are going to write some good comments from an academic perspective. But don't be afraid to maybe make it personal as well. This is a drawing from our pup naming contest that we hold every year. And I've been encouraging the parents of the kids who submit drawings to make sure to include that into their letter. Tell the agency what it's like to educate your kid on wolves and have them be attached to the outcomes of Lobo recovery. I think that this, while it might not change the mind of the whole agency, the people who have to read through these, maybe the future judge, it makes a difference to hear these personal stories. And again, it makes it maybe less of a chore too. So it's not, it might feel more fun to write the letter. So those are some 2 great places to start from. Tip number 3 is adding references. If you have read an article recently or read a book or even watched a short film or anything about Mexican gray wolves, wolf habitat, it's never a bad idea just to list some references. I think that I've seen in the past where somebody didn't add a certain article that they thought they were going to need in the future, and then we looked through some comments and it turned out somebody had referenced that article, and so in the future an attorney could be able to say, well, that article was part of those comments and should be able to be referenced in some future court case. But more importantly, I think what it does say to the agency is you have to be rationalizing based on science. You have to give reason based on science, and you have to add their references in as well. And so I find that if we hold that standard to ourselves, it really is, it communicates that well to the agency that that's our expectation. And you don't have to get all footnotey about it. I mean, you can if you want, but even just referencing, these are the things that I'm using to learn about wolves, I think is a good idea. Okay, tip number 4. This is my personal favorite. Consider making your point with a question. I find that sometimes when I'm not sure exactly how to word something so I sound more like an expert, if I turn it into a question, and maybe a leading question, it's actually can come off sounding almost more powerful in a way. Also, what's going to happen when you write these letters is they'll go into a text search, and they do actually look for questions, because presumably through these comment periods, the agencies are answering your questions and concerns. And it's not that they're probably going to go through and answer every question, but if you ask a question in a unique way, there is more likelihood that they're going to actually recognize that question when they do their responses. Later on in the process, they do actually respond to the points that are made in these comments. Again, this is a way to give yourself also just the permission to not be the expert. You know a lot, you can ask a really informed question, but if you ask it as a question, then you're not necessarily worrying if it's exactly accurate statement. Yeah. Tip 5. So you're going to go through the whole trouble of writing a letter to a comment into the agency. Make sure to send a copy to all of your elected officials, even down to the state, even why not municipal level. I think it's really important for elected officials to know what their constituents are spending time commenting on. And even if it seems like the person that you might send it to might have nothing to do with Mexican gray wolves, they may be in a position down the road in their career where they do have some leverage, and it would be good for them to be educated on Mexican gray wolves. Because they are your elected officials, they're more likely to actually, look at it, or somebody in their staff may look at it. And then you also have basically written a lot of stock language for a really good letter to the editor. You could make this into an actual full op-ed piece if you wanted to, and try to submit that to the editor of your local paper. But at the least, you're going to have a bunch of sentences and points that you make that could make a really concise letter to the editor. And a lot of the times, papers won't publish letters unless they're referencing articles specifically, but there's been quite a bit of press lately about Mexican gray wolves, and I think it's actually likely that you may be able to get that letter published. So go ahead and take that that text that you worked on and turn it into a letter to the editor. So those are my 5 tips. Probably the biggest one is just you have to sit down and actually write the darn thing. We do have, I'm going to send out after this webinar, maybe tomorrow, links to some talking points and some stuff on our website. If you haven't seen it, that could be helpful for you. And of course, if you need any help, you're welcome to contact me, Amy at MexicanWolves.org, or any of the panelists, and let us know if you need any help. The comments are due June 15th. And let's see, there's my email. And that's all. So thank you all for sticking with us. We went a little over time, but that's all right. We have some great questions here that I'm going to run through. There was a couple of ones on here that were just clarifying, so I'm going to quickly knock some of these out. There was a question about who to send the letters to, and sorry, that wasn't clear. That is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, not the state agencies. There is a portal on the Fish and Wildlife Service website that they're accepting those comments, and the email I'll follow up will have a link to those. There's also all of our organizations' websites have links to that page, and yeah. There was a question about what is the FEIS, which was referenced in one of the presentations. That's the final environmental impact statement. And so after the scoping period, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to have to go back and write an environmental impact statement. And then they'll submit that back out to the public, and we'll have another opportunity to review and look at what are the implications of these rule changes through the eyes of that document. So that's what that reference is. And then there's a question about whether the wolves were counted on the White Mountain Apache reservation, and there's some of them are. White Mountain does not release a number. So and then there was a question about the population number. So when they do the annual population count, they're counting the wolves that have the collars, and then when they're out there for that period of time, they're also counting ones that they visually see. So they follow the ones with the collars, and then if those wolves are with a pack, they'll try to count the pack. It's not an entirely accurate number, and in fact, it could be a sort of conservative number. It could be on the low end, but that's the way that they do that once a year when the population number is at its most stable. So, okay, I'm gonna just run through a couple of these and hand them off to people. Sorry, hang on one sec. There was a question from Catherine, so adult releases allowed in zone 1, but however, no adult releases have taken place in recent years. And that was another one I was gonna clarify. That's true. They have not released adults since 2006. And yeah, okay. I like this one from Dolores. If something shocking occurred and the rule required coexistence actions by ranchers, there would also need to be consequences for a violation. Who would oversee and enforce those requirements? Chris, do you want to take that one?
I'll take a first stab at it, although happy to hear what Roz and Emily have to say. I suspect it would be U.S. Forest Service in charge of mandating those coexistence measures and implementing any punishment for not following them, although I suspect it could also be Fish and Wildlife Service kind of in concert. And I would also not be surprised if state game agencies were involved too, since they have a lot of capacity on the ground to do some of that work. So probably the Forest Service primarily, although likely a combination of all the agencies.
Great. And then there was a question, did Arizona Game and Fish Department explain why the I-40 boundary was wanted? Emily, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I can do that. Can you hear me okay? Sorry if I was a little quiet during my presentation, but so there's basically a couple excuses on why they do not want wolves north of I-40, but that is basically what they're saying is that was the extent of the historic range for Mexican wolves to the north. And so they don't want to reintroduce Mexican wolves outside their historic range. That's been pretty thoroughly kind of debunked by a number of other scientists that have said, you know, looking at the genetics of Mexican wolves and specimens in collections that have been killed over the years, there were definitely Mexican wolf specimens that were found further north in places like southern Utah, even southern California. As far as Nebraska, I believe there was a specimen there that was considered a Mexican wolf. And geneticists have also said, you know, this really isn't, there's just not a hard line boundary to the extent of a range of a species, such as a wolf that was such a wide-ranging mammal. So that's one of the things that Arizona Game and Fish and the states like to say, that this, you know, going further north is really outside of the range of their historic habitat. I like to point out that at one point, this was all actually Mexico. So these are just human political boundaries that are shifting, and Mexican wolves have never recognized those. The states also they'd like to see a buffer between the Mexican wolf and the northern gray wolf populations. So basically creating this zone of no wolves in the states of Utah and Colorado, they say is necessary to protect the unique genetics of Mexican wolves. But again, this just doesn't really, you know, fly with the best available science, because wolves were always part of this gradation of subspecies, from Mexican wolves in the south all the way to, you know, Arctic wolves the further north you went. So historically there was this zone of intergradation of different wolf subspecies, so that they are still capable of interbreeding, and in fact geneticists think that might be actually really necessary for improving the genetic health of Mexican wolves over time. So there shouldn't be this buffer zone of no wolves whatsoever north of I-40 and south of like I-70 in the states of Colorado and Utah. It's really important that the wolves start filling in some of this suitable historic habitat. And it really comes down to the states just don't want competition for their trophy elk and deer herds. That's really what the gist of it is, but they don't like to say that because it's not, you know, that comes into conflict with actually recovering Mexican wolves as an endangered species. That's it.
Thanks, Emily. There was a question about how we would know if there was genetics, like how we would know if the genetics was recovered. Roz, do you have some thoughts on that question?
Well, I can start. So they do, when they do the year count, they do look at the genetics of the wolves that they have captured. And so really that's what you need to do, is look at the genetics of the wolves you have captured. But like Emily was saying, and Dave Parsons in the last webinar, is that this is going to be a very long road to recover these wolves, and it's quite possible that they will need some genetic rescue from probably the northern gray wolf at some point in the future. So you need genetic testing is what you need, and if necessary, you are going to have to pull in some genetics from a different subspecies due to the fact that they've declined so much, even from the 7 founders.
Let's see, there's a good question from Heather. According to conservation geneticists, the Mexican gray wolf historically integrated with the northern gray wolf in the northern regions of its range, and this genetic connectivity should be reestablished. However, some wildlife biologists express concern over the Mexican gray wolf going extinct through hybridization with the northern gray wolf. Is this a legitimate concern, and how should it be addressed if when the Mexican gray wolf is reintroduced to the Southern Rockies? Chris, is the Southern Rockies conservation advocate on the call, would you like to talk about this? I know it's complicated, it's a big one. But
yeah, the question's a little bit over my head, so I'll give kind of the elementary school version, and then maybe Emily and Roz can chime in. But there's actually reason to believe that genetic mixing of northern gray wolves and Mexican gray wolves, A, happened historically, and B, is actually helpful for the genetics of both species. I think the concern is about genetic swamping, wherein the genetics of the northern wolves come to dominate the Mexican wolves. But given the geographic separation, my understanding is that that's not a major concern, especially not in the immediate future. Happy to hear more from either Emily and Roz, though.
Yeah, I could just add in that, like what Chris was saying, that, I mean, the only concern that has come up is this potential for genetic swamping of northern gray wolves, because they are, you know, a bigger wolf than the Mexican gray wolf. Could they possibly kind of come in and start taking over Mexican wolf territories? And there was a rebuttal published just a few years ago by geneticists that countered that argument, saying that this idea of swamping that is being pushed by especially states like Arizona Game and Fish, state agencies, that's really not a concern. It is really more important for genetic rescue. And in fact, if we did have Mexican wolves establish territories in these northern core populations, such as the Southern Rockies and the Grand Canyon region, because wolves are territorial, if Mexican wolves are there and released and, you know, actively allowed to re-inhabit those areas, establish territories, they themselves can kind of help prevent swamping on their own, because they'll kind of, they are territorial, and then they'll likely kind of prevent dispersal of northern gray wolves further south, kind of into the core Blue Range wolf recovery area population. So any kind of this intermixing is going to happen most likely on the peripheries at the northern edge, and less likely the further south into the core population. So again, it's beneficial to have northern populations established in that sense.
and I'll just add very quickly, I don't want to belabor it, but historically there were northern gray wolves with a huge range and Mexican wolves with a huge range, interconnected, certainly exchanging genetic material for hundreds and thousands of years, and we didn't see a swamping that got rid of the subspecies. So kind of the layman's terms of what that geneticist that Emily is referring to is talking about.
Great. We'll do maybe one or two more here. Tim asked early on, where do the current governors of these 4 states stand on this issue? Maybe we could go through and speculate. I know that in some ways there's some lack of clarity there, but does anybody want to start on that one?
I'd be happy to talk about New Mexico. Our governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, has indicated that she is at least vaguely supportive of wolf reintroduction, certainly not hostile like our former governor, Susana Martinez, but she's far from a champion, and conservation and wildlife are not by any means her expert issues. So she relies heavily on her state wildlife agency and the state game commission to kind of make those calls. And we've seen kind of tenuous support for the recovery program. New Mexico officially re-entered the partnership with the other agencies, but we haven't seen any kind of heroic or sweeping changes that would lead us to believe that New Mexico is suddenly going to be at the forefront of wolf recovery. But we continue to work here in the state.
And I can just add, like, Governor Ducey in Arizona signed that letter, and he is still in office. So that has not changed in Arizona. I think he has maybe 2 more years, and then he terms out. Utah is also, hasn't really changed politically on their stance towards wolves. And in fact, their state legislature is often passing state bills in Utah that oppose reintroduction of wolves. And they've put into their budget almost every year a lobbying budget to oppose wolves of about $400,000 a year. And then, so Colorado has changed since that letter came out in 2015. And so Colorado also has, besides New Mexico and Colorado are the 2 state governors that have probably changed the most since that 2015 letter. But I can't speak for them or what their opinions are. But if you are interested in looking at some of those documents I cited in my presentation, there is a link on our page that talks about the Grand Canyon region, and it actually has all those documents of political interference, and it has also a lot of references on the science that shows the feasibility of the Grand Canyon region as well. So if you're looking to see that letter itself, you can actually get that on our website.
Just 2 more notes about Colorado. The first gentleman there, Marlon Reese, who is Governor Jared Polis' husband, is a big animal and wildlife champion. So that probably bodes well for the state's direction in terms of wolves. But the second point is they have a bigger wolf issue in front of them than Mexican wolf recovery, which is the ballot initiative coming up later this fall to reintroduce gray wolves in the state.
Great. Well, we're coming up on an hour and a half. I want to respect people's time. I'll try to answer some of these questions off the webinar. Just looking. There was some comments about using social media to leverage comments, and definitely that's a great idea. If you can put your comment up on social media or encourage people to be commenting, that absolutely be in my tips. And there was also a question of whether it's actually effective to be commenting. And I think I want to make sure, yeah, thanks, Chris. I want to make sure to just reassure people that there are a number of ways that this is actually a very effective way to see real outcome. We know that the agencies have to have the cover to be able to say, we heard from all these people, the majority of the comments were from pro-wolf people. And if they don't get that cover, it's very hard for them to justify doing things that they really need to do. So that, for one, is a good reason. And then I think in terms of, making sure you're making unique points, as opposed to maybe doing a form letter or just clicking on something, which isn't a bad way to go, but these unique letters are actually really important because they do build a case. They do have to actually go through them and look at them and refer back to them. And I think if we can show that there are this many people willing to make the case, it does have an influence. It seems hard to believe, but we know that these are actual humans that have to make a determination, and we do see a better outcome when we get more people engaged, particularly early on at the scoping level. It really helps inform how seriously they take public input throughout the whole process. And again, just making sure to amplify whatever your comments are in whatever way you can. Social media, sending it to a letter to the editor is always really good. Yeah, and I think I will, there was a question about whether we have an excellent environmental attorney, and I do want to give some props to our excellent environmental attorneys. We work with several different groups, particularly Western Environmental Law Center, and I appreciate the question because I think a lot of times people assume that there's always enough attorneys, and of course there never are. So support your local conservation group to be able to continue to get the number of attorneys needed to win these things. Do any of you all have any other closing thoughts or any other responses to some of these questions before we close out?
I have to get out of here pretty quick, but I really appreciate everyone taking the time, and Emily and Roz and Amy for hosting and doing the legwork. So appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks you all so much. And I'll send out a link to the YouTube so you can share this with your friends and family. And thanks so much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.